Bias tape is simply a strip of fabric cut on that 45-degree diagonal angle so that it maintains as much stretch as possible. The strip of fabric has its raw ends folded in, and then it has one more fold. This allows it to be used in many craft and sewing projects to finish up raw edges. You can use it in bag making and in the making of clothing, aprons. It's often used. So we're going to talk about how to make bias tape and how to install it. You can buy it at a craft or fabric store. You can buy it online. It comes in cotton or polyester cotton blends, sometimes 100% polyester. There's many different ways to buy bias tape, and it comes in a lot of different pretty colors. The advantage to making it yourself is that you have control over the content of the fabric and the quality of the fabric. You have full control over whether it matches your project. So you can use a strip of fabric that you're going to be using in your project or something that you coordinate and match with that. As far as cost goes, there are ways to save money making your own bias tape. There's also ways to spend more money. So I don't know that that's your biggest factor in deciding whether to make your own or not. But let's deep dive in and make a piece of bias tape. Okay, here I have a square of fabric, and I am going to fold it on the diagonal, kind of like you would a bandana. And then I'm simply going to take this folded diagonal edge and I'm going to cut that to make our bias tape. Okay, now we have all of our strips, and we are going to cut off these angled ends so that our short ends are nice and straight. Okay, now I'm taking these two strips of fabric and I am placing two of the ends right sides together, matching them up perpendicular, and grabbing my straight edge so if we have a square here where these edges match up, I'm basically drawing a diagonal line through that square with my heat erase marker. I'm going to put two clips in. And take this to my machine and sew along that line. All right, we have sewn our pieces of bias tape together, and this is the result. I'm going to trim that seam allowance way down to, maybe 1/4 inch. And now if we want, we can take this to the iron and iron that seam allowance open so that it lays nice and flat. And now we have a really long piece of bias tape. Okay, here is the wrong side of our bias tape. I've ironed our seam. We did our seam on the diagonal rather than just a straight seam, which would have been a little bit easier. This is going to reduce a lot of bulk. Okay, with our bias tape ironed in half, we now have a center crease that we can use to line up these raw edges so that we can enclose them. Okay, here is our bias tape. Now we get to learn how to install it. Now that I've created this bias tape to match my project, I am going to attach it. This is just a really simple pocket panel, and I'm using a really simple installation. There are multiple ways to install your bias tape, depending on the result you want in the end. And we're going to do a very simple installation here, and then I'm going to show you another alternative in the next step of my project. First, I'm just folding this bias tape around my raw edge and clipping it as I go. When I get into a corner, I'm going to pinch and wrap, kind of like you would a package, mitering that edge really nicely and clipping it. I'll guide this all the way around the curve and clip as I go. Sometimes it feels like I'm folding the fabric into the bias tape rather than the other way around. What matters is the end result. We want a really nice smooth curve. Okay, we've got plenty of clips. Everything is secure. Now, I like to use a tiny dot of fabric glue in a few places. I'm going to start sewing on this edge, so I'm going to put a little bit of fabric glue right in here because sometimes it'll try to wiggle apart a little bit there when I get started. I also am going to put a dot on either side of the corners because it's really important that those don't get bunched up anywhere as we sew. Okay, with that, we're ready to take this to the machine, and I am going to sew right along the inner edge of the bias tape all the way around. I just want to make sure I'm also catching it on the back. So when I look at how that's laying there, make sure I'm not so close to the edge that I don't catch it on the back as well. All right, we've attached the bias tape all around the raw edges of the top of our pocket panel. I'm going to attach the pocket panel to my project, and then we're going to come back and finish up with bias tape around the entire project, and I'm going to show you another technique for installing the bias tape. Here is a quick close-up view of how we're going to install this bias tape on our actual project. First, I will open it up and I'm going to put right sides together, the edge of the bias tape, that long edge with the long edge of my project. Clip it in place, and each time I come to a corner, I am going to draw, I'm going to line the corner up here with my mat, and I'm going to draw a line at 45 degrees, 45-degree angle from this corner. And I'm using a gel pen so that hopefully you can see this. From the real project, I'm going to use a fabric marker, a heat erase marker. You can see how that line goes right 45 degrees into that angle, and I'm making sure it's long enough to hit this first fold, that first crease in the fabric. Now I'm going to sew down in the crease, and then I'm going to pivot and take my seam right into that corner back and forth to sew that entire corner. Then we'll take it out of the machine and I'll show you that next step. Here I have sewn, and then I have sewn into the corner at a 45-degree angle. Now I'm going to take my fabric and fold it back at that 45-degree angle right along my stitching. And then I'm going to fold it down over itself. Let's make sure that's opened up. And I'll put a clip in. This is how we're going to sew the next edge. We're going to start at this end. Again, we're going to sew into this crease and all the way to the next corner, which before we get there, we will have marked with our 45-degree angle, where we will do the same thing, where we'll stop at our mark and stitch down into the corner and back up, take it out of the machine, fold the fabric at a 45-degree angle, and then straight down. Okay, my pocket panel is attached to my project, and we are ready to bind all 4 edges. This is going to be a sew side organizer. It'll sit off the edge of the sewing table. I've got a pocket in the back that will slip a ceramic tile into to weight it so that it can hang off the edge of a table. This particular item is a gift for a good friend of mine, and I want it to look beautiful. So I made enough of our bias tape to bind the entire perimeter of the project. Okay, this is as far as I'm going to sew it from now. For now, I'm going to sew from here all the way to the corner. I'm going to sew in this little ditch where this first fold was. And then I'm going to sew down along the line we drew right into the corner. This is the mitered edge on that first corner. And in our final step, when we do the top stitching, everything's going to fold over and lay beautifully. I'm going to draw a seam right here. We need to make a straight line through both pieces of bias tape, and we need that line to be visible from these wrong sides. I'm going to take a ruler to make my line nice and straight. I have a straight line on the wrong side of the bias tape, and in the same location I'm making a straight line on the wrong side of the other edge of bias tape. Now we are going to lay these two ends of bias tape right sides together, match up our lines. I'm going to clip them in place at both ends. It's going to try to tug, so I'll need to combat that and make sure it's all lined up. With that clipped, I'm going to pull my project out of the way, and I'm going to put this through in the machine and sew along that line, making sure that it's still, both of our lines line up nicely. Now I'm going to trim my seam down and cut off all this excess bias tape. Trimming my seam down to about 1/4 inch. I'm going to fold that seam open and finger press it. And then continue clipping down the side. Okay, you know what? I want to tighten this down a little. It looks like my seam slipped from the line a little. It's a little baggy. I'm going to stick it back in the machine and tighten it up just slightly. Because our bias tape has a nice stretch to it, we would rather have a tight seam than a loose seam, because we can always stretch it and make it work. So that looks a lot better. The bagginess is out, and I'm going to clip that and sew our last side. Okay, the first step of installing this bias tape is done. And now we are gonna fold the bias tape around to the back. And just like before, we're gonna clip it all the way around. Make sure our corners look nice. And when we flip it, we're gonna wanna miter our corners on the back side so that they match the corners on the front. Folding those in just so. And at the very end, before sewing, I'll probably put a drop of glue in these corners as well. I like to have everything clipped first in case things shift and need to be moved around. Just want you to notice how nice this looks, how nice and straight that edge is. This technique takes a lot longer because there's extra steps involved, but the result at the end is so nice and professional looking that when I'm going around lots of 90-degree right angle corners and long edges, I like to use this technique. I find it doesn't work quite as well around curves, for me anyway. Okay, I've been really fussy with this. I've got it all clipped in place. Put in just a drop of glue on the backs of the corners where I mitered them. And I'm ready to put it in the machine. And I am gonna sew again close to the edge. This time we are top stitching all the way around. Here we go. That completes our bias tape installation. We've done a really simple installation around curves, and we've done a more involved installation that makes super nice mitered corners and straight edges along long straight seams. With that, our sewing organizer is also complete. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. If you're interested in making a sewing organizer like this, I'm working on a pattern for that right now, and when it's complete, I will put the link to that in the description below, so check back.